This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halper.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon because we're counting on you. Every week, we bring you interviews with authors of books and research and other things that we find fascinating. Today's interview is brought to you by Tel Aviv University's Stephen Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism and Racism.
And our guests are Scott Uri and Guy Meron, who co-edited a brand new collection entitled Antisemitism, Historical Concept, Public Discourse. It came out in Hebrew as a special edition of Tzion, Israel's oldest and most prestigious journal for Jewish history. Dr. Uri is a senior lecturer in Tel Aviv University's Department of Jewish History, the outgoing director of the Roth Institute, and the director of the Beeson Institute for Historical Consciousness, as well as the editor of the Journal of History and Memory. Professor Meron is Vice President for Academic Affairs at Israel's Open University. He's a historian, and his studies focus on modern Jewish history. Hello to you both, and welcome to the show.
Hi. And thanks. Good. Thanks to be here.
So one of the long-standing bones of contention in the study of anti-Semitism is not whether it's hyphenated or not, even though that's a serious issue in itself, but rather whether it's a concept in its own right or should be studied alongside other forms of hatred and bigotry. In fact, you're right that the Roth Institute is one of the only institutions that is officially dedicated to the study of anti-Semitism, together with contemporary racism, as the name suggests, and does it not without strain. Scott, can you explain the main sources of the controversy and why the Roth Institute chose this particular perspective, as well as, what problems it brings to the fore?
Sure. So I think when the Roth Institute was created 15 or 20 years ago at Tel Aviv University, I think there was a core of scholars who believed that anti-Semitism at the time should be studied in connection to and alongside other forms of racism. This, I would say, was in the 1980s, late 1990s, where there's still consensus in Israeli academia that anti-Semitism was a form of racism. I think Guy and I have noticed, or at least I noticed, and I tried to convince Guy throughout writing the book, although we had our disagreements, which is part of the fun, that over the past generation or two, a new consensus has emerged in the study of anti-Semitism, with a hyphen, or without a hyphen. And this new consensus has really led to the crystallization of anti-Semitism studies as a specific field, as anti-Semitism as a separate historical, sociological, political phenomenon. As a result, we now have institutes, and I'm happy because they're all great institutes, for the study strictly of anti-Semitism at Indiana University, in Bloomington, Indiana, in Berlin, at the Center for Research of Anti-Semitism in Berlin, at the Birkbeck College, the Pearson Institute, and even in Winnipeg, and I apologize, whoever I've forgotten. So the vast majority of centers dedicated to the study of anti-Semitism in the past 20 years focus specifically on anti-Semitism. This has been accompanied by a wave of scholarship which looks at anti-Semitism as a specific, unique, and separate historical phenomena. Guy, agree or disagree?
From my perspective, it has to do a lot with the question of uniqueness in Jewish history in general. I mean, we probably speak about the Holocaust later on. And is there something unique in the way Jews were hated throughout history, or in the late 19th century, or during the Nazi period, or when it is becoming unique? And what is actually the meaning of the category of uniqueness in history? I mean, to make a long story short, my opinion is that everything in history is unique, including this talk right now, which means that nothing is really unique. And we have to think in general categories, otherwise we won't understand anything and we cannot be able to analyze anything. This is my problem in isolating, and not only the anti-Semitism, but also other aspects in Jewish history and understanding them not in the context of wider perspective.
Well, I think this leads to actually a question we had for later, but is that question of whether anti-Semitism is unique or part of a historical category actually tainted by emotions? Because it is such an emotional topic, all of the recent historical events, on which that devastated Jewish society are so recent in living memory. Can we actually have that conversation about uniqueness or non-uniqueness without being overrun even by academics who are emotional about it?
I would say that part of our project had to do with a great effort to make a differentiation between the public discourse, the public opinion, and the academic discourse. And we did a real effort not to say explicitly what we want to state about the general public view, because if we as historians come within Zion, with Zion, the journal of the Historical Society, to tell the wider public, the politicians, don't speak about anti-Semitism in this way, this is not our job. Our job has to do with working in the field of Jewish history, in the professional field, in Israel and in the world, and try to analyze this topic. And also within this context, of course, we have emotions, but as professionals, we have to look at the things from a perspective. And still, this is a very emotional topic, even within the professionals.
So just, if I may, this is another one of the wonderful points where Guy and I agree and disagree at the same time. When I started at Tel Aviv University 10 years ago, I automatically, or at the same time, I became director of the Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And although I'd studied anti-Semitism, I didn't really develop academically within that field. And I was surprised that when I began to run this institute, how seriously people took the study of anti-Semitism and how much it meant to them. And it took me a year or two to kind of process what that meant and to really understand what Dali was referring to, how this is really a field that is so laden with so many different emotions. Fear, hatred, sadness, et cetera, et cetera. Trauma, on many different levels. And so what I would take a slightly different approach than Guy, and I think that the emotions are always going to be there. And so the point wasn't to separate ourselves from the emotions, but to create a forum where we could talk about those emotions. And to do that, we needed to kind of go through history and kind of take a look at different chapters in history and to really take a hard look at the term itself, anti-Semitism, and to pardon the phrase, but to try to deconstruct it or to look at it in specific contexts, generation after generation after generation, and see what it meant in each time period. And that's why we had 22 different chapters looking at anti-Semitism, everything from ancient Rome till yesterday. But I think the emotions are always there. They're very raw, and they're there in a lot of other aspects of Jewish history. Guy has studied the Holocaust for many years as well. I have not really studied the Holocaust directly, but I don't know many other fields where it's that emotional, and it's that driven, and it's that present. And so the question for me was, how do you deal with such an emotionally laden topic, which is always going to be emotionally laden? A little bit different maybe than Guy's perspective. I'm a bit of a pessimist and Guy's an optimist.
But it's not really just about emotions that are, in a way forgivable. It's also something about more sinister than that, and that is political co-optation that you also mentioned in the book. Many people use the study of anti-Semitism or even the existence of anti-Semitism for their own political ends, whether it's to defend Israel at any cost, or to use it as a stick to bash Israel. And here we talk about, to the two ends of the spectrum, maybe Robert Westrich on the one hand and Judith Butler on the other. But what do you do? I mean, there it comes back to the differentiation between the scholarly realm and the public discourse. What do you do when you study a topic that everyone has an opinion on? It's like, and it's not just restricted to anti-Semitism. It's also any kind of modern history. I'm putting it out to you. For example, the study of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Everyone has an opinion on it. How do you, draw the boundaries of the scholarly field?
I think that part of the challenge of historians in our generation, unlike maybe 2 or 3 generations ago, is that we are forced, even if we don't want to be, modest. We have to be modest because when our real potential to have a real impact on the public discourse is unfortunately very, very low. I mean, 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, historians were among the leaders of nations, ministers, had a lot of impact on the public opinion. Today, real academics are mostly, I wouldn't say isolated, but the professional discourse is in itself, its influence on the whole society, on the immediate impact is very limited. But we try to do something which will have a longer run impact, to develop an international discourse which will be above the current political day-to-day discourse. I think this is the challenge here, from my perspective.
I think, you're right. And we actually, in one of our earlier drafts of the introduction, we wanted to start with saying that you ask anybody in the Jewish world what they think about anti-Semitism, everyone will have an opinion about what it is, and someone will tell you how it happened, how it gets resolved. I'm looking here at the poster behind Gilad. There's a famous episode from Seinfeld where Uncle Leo's hamburger is burnt, and you don't just burn a hamburger. And Uncle Leo, Jerry's uncle, sees anti-Semitism everywhere, and he thinks he knows what it is. And this is one of the challenges in writing this volume. This is one of the challenges I had when running this Roth Institute at Tel Aviv University for 10 years. This is one of the challenges we have when we step into a classroom of 20, 30, sometimes even more students and say, we're going to talk about something which you think you know about. I'm going to walk you back slowly through separate chapters in history. I'm going to talk about how what you think you know has developed over time and why. I mean, this is really the intellectual intervention that I at least tried to make, is to take a moment, whether it's a time when people read the book or it's an hour and a half of a classroom or it's a 13-week semester, and say, okay, this is a topic we think everyone thinks they know everything about it. But I'm going to go walk back in time and give you 15 different examples of how and why how it might change and developed over time, and how we got to the point today where this cultural baggage or this cultural code, as it were, that we all inherited in school from our parents, from our families, is anything but neutral. And then how do you talk about that? And then these other examples are the same thing. It's the Holocaust. It's Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's Poles and Jews, something I deal with historically. Everyone thinks they know what they're talking about. But even today, or even the past few weeks, if it's the prime minister talking about Iran, or it's people in the Haredi community talking about the restrictions and that relate to COVID, the term anti-Semitism is used time and again, and everybody uses it differently to mean something totally different.
I would add what Scott said and about our position in the society, and this was mentioned actually in one of the articles, is that I see myself also as an educator. Not an educator to the public to say to them, this is the real version of history, but to trying to make people think about history in a more reflective and self-critical way. And I think this is part of what our volume is trying to do, not necessarily to teach you what is anti-Semitism is all about or how to rethink about it. And I must confess that I'm happy personally that since I wrote the introduction with Scott and didn't have to write an article and to give a clear opinion about it, because I'm still very confused about what actually I think is the answer for the question of what do you see anti-Semitism as a phenomenon in itself in the long run, or maybe you should deconstruct it. I'm still very struggling about this question. But part of being an educator, from my perspective, is to give a softer message and an effective message to the readers.
One of the ways to address this issue is expressed by David Engel's article that is in many ways the centerpiece of the volume. It's called On the Evolution of the Concept Antisemitism and Its Use as an Aggregate Category. And his way of dealing with it is not dealing with it. Just say he himself says that he hasn't used the term anti-Semitism since the early 1990s. Can you, saying that the flaws outweigh the benefits of using it? Can you explain his position? And I'd like to also to put to you, isn't it quite defeatist just not to talk about it, to ignore the elephant in the room?
I don't think that everything else is ignoring the elephant in the room. I mean, for those of you who didn't read his research, he's working for 30 or 40 years about Jewish and Jewish, non-Jewish relations, anti-Jewish pogroms, even massacres. I mean, this is what he's doing as his research career. What he was saying is that using the concept anti-Semitism, and specifically as an abstract term with a wide generalization, is distorting the way we think about history and our self-critical approach to the materials we're doing. So I think it's not ignoring something, it's just suggesting not to use a category which he sees as obscure and too much generalizing, and instead of it speaking in a more concrete context about Jewish, Polish, Jewish Catholic relations in Poland in the interwar period, or anti-Jewish riots in Tsarist Russia in late 19th century, etc.
Is it too abstract because it's like the Uncle Leo anecdote, because everything is can be anti-Semitism?
Well, I think this is one of the points where Guy and I actually do agree that this is a wonderful essay, and I politely disagree with Gilad, who I respect tremendously as well, that this is a wonderful essay, and he's not sweeping the question away in my mind. He's not dismissing the question. He's actually creating a whole new question. He's making life much more difficult for scholars, for students, and for readers. And he's saying, if I understand him correctly, I think, after reading it and having it translated several times, He's saying that, okay, let's put this term on the side. Let's think about these phenomena separately, whether it's social prejudice, mass murder, prejudice in the street, violence. These are all different events, and to refer to them all apropos via Uncle Leo's term of anti-Semitism flattens history and makes a huge general universalization of all these different phenomena. And so I think it's not sweeping the problem under the rug. He's actually opening the box, the Pandora's box, and forcing us to rethink about this question. And through that question, to think about the nature of relations between Jews and non-Jews throughout history.
I mean, I think there are major ramifications to this because it kind of says each specific aspect of the phenomenon are things that we can apply to many other social cases. But I read his critique a little differently in the responses to it, which is that in addition to everything you guys said, the term anti-Semitism has come to refer to things throughout such a long scope of history, so many different kinds of events, that it is simultaneously an umbrella term and a term related to many, many manifestations. So can we cut through that divide?
I would say that it's important to understand that part of the history of anti-Semitism is the history of how people use the term anti-Semitism. And maybe I'll give you one example, which I think is a key point in modern Jewish history. This is the part of the diary of Moshe Leib Lilienblum, one of the founding fathers of Chibat Zion. There's an early Zionist movement in Zaristosha. After the pogrom in Odessa in 1881, he's writing, now I understand the meaning of the term anti-Semitism. Now I understand that what is happening now in Odessa and what was happening in Berlin a few years ago and what was happening hundreds of years ago elsewhere is part of the same phenomenon. What I'm saying is that Lilienblum was creating what is called a speech act. He actually created the concept which made his later political career possible. And we shouldn't accept it as a historical fact in itself, but as a speech act that we should analyze as historians. And if we want to be critical about it, we have to be reflective about the way he constructed this term. And this is only one example.
But it also comes not without problems, as one of the contributors to the volume says, Javi Dreyfus, who will be our guest here on the Tel Aviv Review soon. She says, in a way, that when coming to study the Holocaust, there's a great deal of significance in applying to that historical episode as something that is, anti-Semitic in and of itself, in a way, right? That, by deconstructing the term anti-Semitism, you do a disservice to the historical study of the Holocaust.
I just want to say I read Javi Dreyfus's critique through the lens of Tolstoy, right? Just to be completely cliche, that every unhappy family is unhappy in a very unique way, but we can't lose sight of the family. They are all families. Something unites them. So is that a good metaphor for her approach?
I think that this is a good essay, and I wish Javi were here as well to discuss it with us.
Oh, she will be.
But
right, not together.
I think this is something that's come up in the past 20 or 30 years in the study of the Holocaust, to the extent to which the Holocaust is tied to anti-Semitism, bound by anti-Semitism. I think we have different opinions in the volume as well, and this is one of the cases where Javi Dreyfus's essay is juxtaposed with the essay by Amos Goldberg and Roth Segel, in which they take a radically different perspective, in which they say that the Holocaust is not the result of anti-Semitism, it's not driven from anti-Semitism. It's the result of modernity and the march of totalitarianism, or the drive to the nation state.
This is Goldberg and Segel.
Goldberg and Segel, excuse me, sorry. And I think that these two perspectives, I'm happy, and we're both happy that we have two radically different perspectives in the same volume. I, on this point, disagree with Javi Dreyfus. I don't think there's any problem taking the anti-Semitism out of the Holocaust. I think it actually does a service to both concepts. I think too often, if we look, and we talked about this a bit in the introduction, too often we see the Holocaust as a culmination of 2,000 years of study of anti-Semitism, and then becomes one long teleology from Christ to the Crusades to the pogroms to the Holocaust. I think you need to disassociate actually the two terms and the two concepts, Holocaust and anti-Semitism, to actually understand them better.
Yeah, so I believe we'll a little disagree about this context. I think that taking the anti-Semitism generally, totally disconnecting it from the Holocaust, is a very radical way, suggesting an interpretation which will put it in a wider context and add many other aspects which were specifically concrete. I wouldn't say unique, because everything is unique, so nothing unique, as I said before, but giving the specific context which will explain why the Jewish hatred of the Jews in the 1940s culminating in mass murder, whereas in the late 19th century it was only a political and public opinion discussion, is a historical challenge. And using the very term anti-Semitism will not help us in this. But not using it at all is problematic on the other hand. But let me add to the discussion a wider topic, which has to do with the using of concept in more general, because part of the discussion between Javi on the one hand and Amos and Raz on the other hand is also about the term Holocaust. I mean, should we use it when we speak about all these events? And one of the previous books of Raz Segal is called Genocide in the Carpathians, and he's calling it Genocide in the Carpathians deliberately not to mention the word Holocaust and putting what happened to the Jews in the wider context of the inter-ethnic political and actually violence between Hungarians, Romanians, Ukrainians, and other groups. For me, it was not fully convincing. I mean, I think he had a very important point in trying to see the anti-Jewish violence in a wider context, but taking out the categories of anti-Semitism and Holocaust in a so radical way, for me, it was not convincing, but very challenging.
Well, why does this have to be an either-or? Can't we think about multi-causal explanations as historians?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think about it. This is why the radical positions I find them problematic. Maybe this is why I had the pleasure to be co-editor and not to give a very clear-cut decision about it.
It's a hefty price to take an easy way out. There are easier ways to get out of writing an article.
I also want to point out that this overlaps to some extent with an interview we did maybe 2 years ago now with Christopher Browning and his debate with Daniel Jonah Goldhagen about whether anti-Semitism is the primary exclusive factor that explains what happened in Germany at that time. So,
yeah, look it up.
Look
to
it
all
up.
our listeners,
Yes.
it's in our archive. I want to go now to another minefield, and that is the term new anti-Semitism. What's your take on it?
So I think this is another key point in the introduction and in the volume is the term the new anti-Semitism, which is kind of actually not so new anymore. It's been around, I think, since the early 1970s to describe what people claim is a form of anti-Semitism, which no longer focuses on Jewish individuals or Jewish communities, but focuses on the state of Israel and its policies, as it were, as what is called by Robert Wistrich and other supporters of this concept, the new anti-Semitism, as the collective Jew, as it was referred to. I think this is where we get exactly, as Gilad said, to this minefield, this point where it becomes very political very quickly and very hard to try to kind of deconstruct and untie all these different intertwining and interconnecting strands of thought. And that's what we tried to do also in the volume, is trying to take a step back and say, okay, this is the new anti-Semitism. What's new about it? What's not new about it? How is it used on both sides of the political map? Both by people who want to say all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, and by people who want to say criticism of Israel is never anti-Semitic. I think we're lucky in that we wrote a volume that we can have different voices and different opinions on that question. Here as well, I thought that, and I felt that, and I hope that the volume gave us an opportunity to really take a moment and to think about the term and to offer different perspectives about how the term developed, how we got to the position where anti-Zionism is suddenly equals anti-Semitism. Of course, on the one hand, that's obviously not the case. There have been many people throughout history, Jews and non-Jews, who are anti-Zionist. Members of the Jewish labor Bund in the 19th century and the 20th century in Poland and Russia were not anti-Semitic when they were anti-Zionists. Members of the Reform movement in America in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s when they were anti-Zionists were not anti-Semitic. And even today, some people who oppose some of Israel's policies at various sides of the Green Line are not always anti-Semitic, and they're not anti-Semitic from the get-go. They have problems with Israel's policies. And so that's exactly where we wanted to get into, and there's no resolution of this issue, no simple resolution of this issue. And we tried to create a forum where there are different opinions on that point.
I would say also, not only in the context of anti-Semitism but general, that most of the writers in our volume, it doesn't have to represent the whole community of scholars, of course, most of the writers, mostly Israelis, will not agree with David Engel's radical position about not using the concept anti-Semitism, but I think all of them will be now more self-critical in choosing when to use it and when not to use it. And I think if, in the context of what you asked before about the new anti-Semitism, people will be more aware of it and not using the term anti-Semites about everyone who has critique or something to say that you don't like to hear about the state of Israel, this will be a small contribution of our discourse. I find it very important.
I mean, the new anti-Semitism, as defined by the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism, leads to several absurd situations where Israeli opponents of the occupation suddenly are called anti-Semitic. So there's really, to a certain extent, some people concerned that the new anti-Semitism, IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism, have gone too far and are stifling and or inhibiting free speech on some of these issues.
So, I mean, the question is, having written this volume and addressed this issue so thoroughly, can you draw a line? Can you give us some criteria where criticizing Israel's policies or criticizing Zionism does cross the line? Do you have any objective measure of that?
We didn't set out to create an objective measure
I know,
of this.
but did anything come out of the articles, I guess?
And I think that one of the things that I think is that all these attempts in history to define, I mean, your actually question is asking me to contradict the entire purpose of the volume, which is not to define anti-Semitism. So we're trying to get away.
Which contradicts the purpose of my question.
So if you allow me to disagree politely, I think that we want to get away from definitions. I mean, obviously, it's kind of like, what is the old saying about pornography? I know it when I see it. Obviously, there needs to be room for people in Israel and outside of Israel to say, hold on a second, what's going on in Hebron, what's going on in Ramallah, what's going on in Jerusalem, or even Yafo or Haifa is not right. And I have a right to say this is not right without being labeled as an anti-Semitic. And this is Judith Butler's point in one of her more recent books, right? At the same time, obviously, there are some fellow travelers and some people, mean-spirited people, and you can't be blind to reality, who use the conflict between Israel and its neighbors, Israel and the Palestinians, to attack Israel and Jews. On the other hand, to say that 15 or 20% of the Israeli population who are Palestinians are anti-Semitic because they don't support the state only for the Jews is absurd.
So maybe, it's the everything always boils down to the occupation and the conflict, right? All roads lead to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And maybe going back to...
have you laid a trap for us?
No, I'm saying, again, laying out the challenges of scholarly endeavors such as yours. Going back to the new anti-Semitism, maybe Engel's call is particularly pertinent in connection to the new anti-Semitism because it's so politicized.
I would say that, first of all, Engel himself will be very sensitive about not using his position to political implications. They wrote it explicitly in the conclusion article of the book. But what I will say about it is that I think, and this is maybe a little also a political opinion of mine, that one good thing that we might do for the Arab-Israeli conflict will be to separate it from the wider question of anti-Semitism, from the events in Europe, from the wider discourse about antisemitism. And let me give you an example from my own family history. We spoke about emotions. My grandfather was a survivor of the Hebron massacre in 1929. He was saved by an Arab. So, I mean, he might have been massacred by Arabs, but he was saved by Arabs. Is this an anti-Semitic event? I think probably not. This is an inter-ethnic struggle between two peoples who might be very violent and very terrible, but what the Arab did to Jews in 1929 had to do with the anti-Jewish riots in Poland, in Zaristosha, in the medieval Europe? I don't think so.
So maybe I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I don't have a very good family history or anecdotes to tell, so I apologize. But I think that Gilad, I want to thank you for this question. I don't know what David Engel meant to do when he wrote this article originally 15 years ago. Maybe he doesn't anymore. People change their minds. I don't know if we had one opinion. No, we didn't have one opinion about this volume. But I think you're right. If people take this volume and read part of the essays, I'm not going to read all the essays, read part of the essays, and it gives them a moment to pause and think about the use of the term anti-Semitism today in our social political discourse here in Israel or in the diaspora or in communities that care about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it gives them a moment to think about, hold on a second, maybe we need to rethink about whether or not this is anti-Semitism. Maybe we need to think about the different causes of the conflict and the causes of the people's behavior. If we've done that, then the 4 years that we slaved over this volume have been worth it.
Speaking of the many diverse articles in there, we can't obviously get to all of them, but one of them maybe is a little outside of this discussion, but I found it very original, and that's the article by Susanna Heschel, where talking about terminology, she creates new terminology, erotohistoricism, and she deals with what I consider the corporeality of anti-Semitism, which leads us, if you're talking about the body, to all sorts of other forms of racism, including against African Americans. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of that article in the volume and how it plays into the ideas?
I think one thing we tried to do in the volume was to bring in a collection of different voices. And we wanted people working in Israel, people not working in Israel, people working in Jewish studies, people working outside of Jewish studies, even Jews and non-Jews, etc. Sometimes succeeded, sometimes less so. Susanna Heschel, who listeners may or may not know, is the daughter of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and teaches at Dartmouth College in the States, wrote an essay about the emotional response and emotional aspects of anti-Semitism, really entering or intersecting or intertwining the history and the study of emotions with the study of hatred, and drawing a lot on the African-American experience. And a lot of what's been written about African-American experience over the past 20 or 30 years, which is a tremendous amount. And she did this volume a wonderful service. Because one of the points I wanted to raise in the volume is there in the introduction is we need to get away from the division of anti-Semitism or other forms of racism. We need to reconnect to scholars and people who are talking about other forms of racism and hatred and to learn from what they've been doing. And it seems and appears that in the study of anti-Black racism in America, there's been a tremendous output over the past 20 or 30 years about the physical, emotional aspects of anti-Black violence, lynching, violence against women, rape, et cetera, et cetera. And Susanna tried to apply that, Professor Heschel tried to apply that to the case of Jews either in pogroms, Eastern, Central Europe. And it's a fascinating article that I hope people will read and teach about the emotional and physical aspects of anti-Semitism. Ironically, I find myself both agreeing with the article and disagreeing with the article, but that's okay. I like the comparative aspects very much.
Which parts did you disagree with?
Well, not that one, didn't I?
I mean, that's what makes it interesting, right? There's a lot in that article. It's many different aspects you can think about.
What I find interesting is that on the one hand, Heschel is trying to use other racial hatreds in order to contextualize the Jewish, anti-Jewish, non-Jewish relations. On the other hand, she disagrees with Engel and saying that using term anti-Semitism should continue. And this is interesting, and this is exactly why I will give my students to read this article.
I found it pretty
Engel.
convincing, I have to say.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting circle. I mean, she really does come full circle to the extent that she says, we need to compare anti-Semitism to other forms of racism, but we can't throw away or do away with the term itself.
Yeah.
And so I think that this position is rather fascinating.
And that brings us back to the raison d'etre for the Roth Institute in looking at anti-Semitism in the context of other forms of racism, doesn't it?
Correct. and the attempts, and again, I mean, it's easy to talk about, and it's actually harder to do because you see over the years that scholars of anti-Semitism over time, because the field has developed so much, because there's so many different institutes for the study of anti-Semitism today, because there's so many people working on the topic, they can basically talk among themselves and not really be in conversation when people are studying anti-Black racism, people are studying hatred against women, people are studying hatred against people who are other kinds of minorities. And so here I think Susanna Heschel tries to bring us back into that, as does the essay by the letter handler on racism in the American South and anti-Semitism. I think that's more challenging. It's exceptionally challenging in the context of the Israeli university because of the way Israeli society has developed and then the challenges of teaching the humanities in Israeli universities. But it's not over yet, I think, but it does make it more challenging to basically telling people, okay, hold on a second, anti-Semitism isn't so unique. Jews are not so unique, and they actually have a lot in common with other people, including African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and maybe even Palestinians.
And as educators, it's very important for us to say this in Hebrew. I mean, most of the students read also English, but putting this in Hebrew and composing this volume in Hebrew and putting it in the wider context of Jewish historiography, I found it very, very important. In most cases in recent decades, I should admit, most of the more innovative projects, including Scott's book, for example, were published in English, and most Israelis have to read them in English. Here it was very important for us to do this innovative project in Hebrew for our readers, hoping, of course, it will be translated to English in the future.
All right, we have a bit more time for one last question. And that family anecdote that you told, Guy, reminded me, or maybe I thought it could be a good segue into another article that I found fascinating, and that is Ofri Ilani's article about the dual nature, perhaps, or the dialectical nature of anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, right? How do the two feed each other? And maybe, it sheds light on the concept of anti-Semitism that we instinctively, perhaps, take for granted as synonymous with, so many vile things, but there's also it's a bit more complicated than that. Can you elaborate on it?
I think part of the position of Ofri Ilani has to do with the way people are relating to Jews doesn't have to be only negative. he's using the term, I'm not sure in the article or in his lectures, the term allo-Semitism, which has to do with the special way you treat Jews. It might be positive, it might be negative. Jews are different, Jews are weird, something essentially is different, and it doesn't have to be necessarily so terrible, so violent, so disastrous like anti-Semitism. It gives you another perspective, and specifically on the period of Enlightenment, which we mostly identify with, thinking about human beings in general in a more abstract way. It's presented also there, and this is part of his thesis.
I think this essay by Ofri Olani, who's now a Polonsky Fellow at the Van Leer Institute, Graduate Tel Aviv University, is another example of what we wanted to do in this volume. I mean, we as people who are Jewish or Israeli, we as people who've been raised in different communities or different educational institutions have been taught to think that, as they say, the whole world is against us. So here, Gilad, I again disagree with you. It's not instinctive. It's something that's developed over time. And so Ofri Ilani comes along and says, hold on a second. Maybe everyone doesn't hate us. Maybe everyone likes us. Maybe there are a lot of people out there who like us. And then how do we deal with that? And so the question isn't whether or not this is instinctive, Gilad. The question is, why do so many people in the Jewish world, in Israel and abroad, ready to assume, like Uncle Leo, I'm looking at Seinfeld behind you, excuse me for using it the third time, but I think it's a great anecdote and I do use it in my classes. Why do they think that you don't just burn a hamburger? Why are so many people willing to think that the world is against us? And the case in point, if you allow me one anecdote from contemporary politics in the United States, is that in 2 months' time, more or less, whether Biden wins or Trump wins, there's going to be a Jewish person within a heartbeat of the Oval Office, either Ivanka or Kamala Harris's husband, Douglas Emhoff. Douglas Emhoff?
Douglas.
Pardon me, Douglas, if you're listening, thank God. So, so on the one hand, on the other hand, American Jewry, over the past 4 or 5 years, for good reason, right? There's the horrible institute in Pittsburgh, at the Tree Life Synagogue in San Diego, in Brooklyn, I believe, if not in the Bronx, we see violent anti-Semitism. So why are so many Jews willing to understand and look at the darker side of anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, Barry Weiss, etc., and not the positive side of American either philo-Semitism or allo-Semitism, where no one really is making an issue of Ivanka Trump being Jewish and Douglas Emhoff being Jewish. I have not seen this as an issue in any way, shape, or form in the elections. So why look at the negative when we can look at the positive?
We have so much more to say about this, but Gilad is giving me that look like, Dahlia, you always ask one more question. So let's maybe...
Go on.
Well, okay, if I have to. I mean, it's not exactly what you're talking about, but I also have a little bit of a suspicion of generalizing positively. Okay, this goes back to studies of prejudice and Gordon Allport. When somebody says to me, "Oh, you Jews, I just love you guys because you're all really smart," I get really uncomfortable.
Why is that? Dahlia, why is that?
Because they are generalizing. And I think if they generalize in a good direction, they will generalize in a bad direction.
This is definitely my position. I mean, I think also this will be a Ofri's position. Allo-Semitism is problematic, not as anti-Semitism in itself, but it's problematic. I mean, Jews were saved...
It's a slippery slope.
I mean, let's get back to the Holocaust. Jews were saved in Denmark, not because they were Jews, but because they were Jewish citizens and because they were human beings. And this is the way I think we all want to be treated. Not because you're smarter, because you're not all. We wouldn't like that our less smart kid or neighbor will not be saved because he's not as he's supposed to be.
Well, speaking as the kid who's always been less smart, let me just, or accused thereof, I again flip the question back to Gilad and Dahlia and to my dear friend Guy. What's so difficult about trying to accept the fact that people don't hate us or like us? We can think of, off the top of my head, 8 or 9 or 10 centers for the study of anti-Semitism. God only knows how many books about anti-Semitism. In the study of philo-Semitism, there's no institute for the study of philo-Semitism. There are very few books about the study of philo-Semitism. So what is it about this topic that draws...
That's your next book topic.
Oh, what's about this topic that draws people to it? And what's about the other topic that makes people suspicious? That's the question. Those are the kind of questions we'd like to ask.
All right. I'd like to leave you and our listeners with that as food for thought. So thank you very much, Scott Uri, Guy Meron, for joining us today.
Thank you, Dahlia. Thank you, Gilad. A wonderful conversation.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the Roth Institute and the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for their generous support. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Every little helps. Check out our archive. It has about 600 interviews, including Christopher Browning and soon Javi Dreyfus. If you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.